Imagine, if you will, you buy a painting from a yard sale. Perhaps it's a painting of a wise old sailor. You bring it home, you're feeling quite proud of the haul that you've gotten for yourself at this yard sale. You have, of course, your old sailor man. You have the complete series of Cheers on VHS, which, of course, you have no VCR to watch them on. But you get home and you put your painting in a place of honor inside of your house. Only later you find that this painting contains an eternally tormented soul that will turn your home into a fiery inferno from which, even if your physical body may escape, your spirit will be trapped in for all eternity. That's right, today we're looking at three supposedly haunted works of art. Back in the 1980s, the Hall family in England was just winding down for the evening. They had cooked up some chips, or some crisps, rather, in a pan, and were enjoying their evening when, much to their dismay, their house began to fill with a thick black smoke. Fortunately, they were able to get out of the house unharmed, and the fire brigade showed up to put out the flames before their house was a total loss. The firefighters eventually determined that it was the pan in which they were cooking the crisps that caused the fire. And as the firefighters are going through the house, making sure that all of the embers had been extinguished, one of the young firefighters comes across something that strikes him as being very strange. There in one of the rooms, surrounded by singed and blackened items, was a painting. But somehow this painting was completely unharmed by the fire. It had no singe marks, it wasn't blackened, it wasn't burning. It stood out among all of this ash and soot. And the subject of the portrait was staring intently into the soul of this young firefighter. Now, if you're from the UK and you're over the age of 30, then you probably already know which painting I'm referring to. It was a rather unsettling portrait of a crying boy. The firefighter is likely thinking to himself, why would anybody have this hanging in their home? And also, how is it that this painting came through the fire unscathed? He calls over one of the other firefighters to show him this discovery and how weird it is. But to his surprise, his comrade was not at all shocked by the fact that this painting had made it through the fire. In fact, he half expected it, because as this firefighter would explain, he had been to no fewer than 15 house fires in which this painting was found completely unharmed. Even in some cases where the rest of the house had been an inferno, this painting somehow came through unscathed. It had become such a common occurrence for him that he started to wonder if there was some connection between this particular painting and these house fires. Now, I'm going to put the painting up on the screen here, and I do have a question. If any of you happen to be from the UK and happen to be old enough to remember when these paintings were very popular, and that is, what was the deal with this? What exactly was going on with these paintings of the crying boy? Now, I'm going to get a bit to the history of the painting in a second. And I know that these paintings were also in the United States throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, but they were particularly popular for whatever reason in the UK. There were no fewer than 50,000 prints of this crying boy sold throughout the UK in the 1980s. It just seems like a rather odd choice to put in your home. I'm imagining I have a long day at work. My manager's been yelling at me. I'm really behind on my reports. It's just been a terrible day. And I come home and I throw my bag down on the couch and I look up, and there, staring at me in the face, is this crying boy. It honestly might make me crazy enough to set fire to my own house, which could be what's going on here, although probably not. Regardless, the case of the Hall family was not a one-off situation. And before long, the UK was flooded with stories about the connection between this painting and house fires. A woman from Surrey purchases one of these paintings, and 6 months later, her house burns to the ground. A woman from the Isle of Wight purchases one of these paintings, and she is so thoroughly creeped out by it that she decides to try to destroy it, which apparently was a huge mistake because after trying to burn this painting, she had a string of terrible bad luck. A pizza parlor in Norfolk hangs up one of these crying boys inside of their establishment, and only a few months later, the whole building burns to the ground, and yet in the ashes of the building, there was one object that came through the fire unscathed, and it was the portrait of this crying boy. In fact, I found an almost immeasurable number of cases of people claiming that they brought this portrait into their house, and within a few months, there was either a fire, or if they tried to destroy or otherwise harm the painting, they experienced just horrendous bad luck. Illnesses, deaths in the family, cars breaking down, the whole gambit. Could this all be a coincidence? Maybe. But is it weird? Absolutely. Given that this was the pre-internet era, right? This was the 1980s. Rumors about this painting and its origins just went absolutely wild because there was no convenient way to look up information about who the artist was, why it was painted, and even where did these paintings come from. If you're a person in the 1980s, it almost seems like these paintings were just cropping up out of nowhere. One year they were nowhere to be found, and the next year, if you went to a yard sale or a thrift shop or anything, chances are you would see one of these crying boy paintings. Some people claimed that the portrait of the crying boy, the subject of the painting, was actually a boy who had died in a house fire. And now if you made the decision to put this painting in your home, then eventually you too would be a victim of a house fire. Some claimed that the boy in the painting had gone to an art studio and he had sat for a portrait. And for whatever reason, when this was done, he set fire to the studio and it burned to the ground. Some claimed that the boy was an orphan and that his parents had died in a house fire. And he poured all of those negative emotions somehow into each and every print of this painting. A little piece of his soul somehow wound up in every single print of these paintings, almost like some sort of weird Horcrux. And if you were bringing it into your house, you were bringing into your home the soul of this boy. The truth about the origins of the crying boy painting are not exactly as creepy as that, but they are sort of strange. And they left me with more questions than I had answers. So the crying boy painting, or what today is commonly referred to as the crying boy, is not just one painting. There are several paintings that are often denoted as being the crying boy. And I'm going to put a few pictures of each on the screen, but all of them are from the same artist. And these were painted by a man named Bruno Amadio, who otherwise goes by the pseudonym of Giovanni Bergoglin. And not a whole lot is known about this guy. There's not much information out there about him. We know that he's from Italy originally, and we know that he emerged sometime post-World War II as a kind of a small-time painter. He would often sell his paintings to tourists, and so this would explain potentially how a lot of his work ended up in the UK and the US. Both countries send a lot of tourists to other places throughout Europe. One way or another, however, Bergoglin was commissioned to paint 65 individual portraits of crying children. And this is, I have some questions about that, right? Was this his idea? Did he kind of get an idea in his head someday that I know what would be a really hot commodity throughout Europe and the UK? I'm going to just paint crying children. Did somebody commission that? Did somebody come to him and say, Giovanni, I got a big job for you. What I need you to do is I need you to paint 65 portraits of crying children. I really don't know, and it doesn't seem like anybody on the internet really knows exactly why these paintings were created. I did read one place that they were created essentially as charity for an orphanage, that he would paint these uh, portraits of crying children, and then the proceeds would go to charity. That's what I choose to believe. I don't know if that's true or not, but that reality makes me feel a whole lot better than any of the other realities. So that's what I choose to believe. Either way, the legend about the crying boy painting causing house fires is perhaps one of the best known urban legends regarding art. It was something that was pretty ubiquitous throughout the 1980s, not only in the UK, but also in the US. It became so widespread, the fear of this painting. At one point in the UK, there was a large scale bonfire that was organized where people from all over the region got together and burned their prints of the crying boy. Whatever the truth might be about this painting, it was a very real phenomenon for the people, especially people living in the UK in the 1980s. But of course, not everybody believed or believes today that these paintings were evil or haunted. Right? There are plenty of people who say there's a rational explanation for what was going on with these paintings. First of all, being the claim that these firefighters saw these paintings in so many house fires that they would visit. And a skeptic would say, well, of course they did. There were 50,000 prints at least of these paintings in the UK in the 1980s. So just based on the numbers alone, they were bound to run into them sooner or later. As far as the painting's ability to resist the massive heat of a house fire, they would say, one, this is probably an exaggeration, right? Either the fire was contained to a different part of the house and the crying boy was in another room, and over time those stories got exaggerated. Or two, it's possible that the prints of these paintings were treated with a lacquer that made them somewhat fire resistant. So if the firefighters got to the house in time and they extinguished the fire, well, then the painting would have survived while other items around it potentially would have burned. But I don't know. The number of stories surrounding the crying boy paintings is simply overwhelming. You can go into Google and type crying boy painting stories, and you will get dozens and dozens of different accounts of these paintings. So I'll ask you, what do you believe about this crying boy painting? Do you believe that it's somehow haunted and somehow connected to house fires? Or do you think that the whole thing is simply a misunderstanding or an exaggeration? If you remember the internet in the year 2000, you know that it was an absolutely lawless place. And few places on the internet were more lawless than eBay. If you were to log on to eBay in the early 2000s or in the late 1990s, you would be able to find anything. And I mean anything on eBay. You could have found a grilled cheese sandwich that supposedly had the image of the Virgin Mary singed into it. You could have bought literal fighter jets off of eBay. You could have bought Justin Timberlake's half-eaten toast on eBay, and of course, plenty of other essentials too. So it's only natural that in the year 2000, a listing was made on eBay for a painting with a very provocative description. And the description claimed that this painting was very, very haunted. The painting itself showed a young boy who was standing in front of a glass window in kind of what looks like a shop. And next to him is what seems to be either a doll-like girl or a girl-like doll, very creepy figure that's standing next to this boy. And the boy himself is staring very intensely forward, while from behind the glass, there are these ghostly hands that are reaching out for him. The woman who was selling this painting claimed that she had found it in an old abandoned brewery. She had been on the property with the owner of the property and found this painting, randomly left it. And even though it was a rather creepy painting, she recognized that there was a lot of artistic talent that went into creating it. And so she asked the owner of the property if it was for sale. And he said, sure, offered a very lowball number for this kind of painting. And of course she accepted. So she thought it was a little bit strange that this man, one, had this random painting in his abandoned building, and two, was willing to sell it for so cheap because it was very clear that the painting was rather well done. The initial bid on eBay for this painting was $199, but as this story began to gain traction on the internet and it started to pop up on other forums and more people visited the listing, that number would go up dramatically over the next few days. And the primary reason for the price hike was not because of the artistic quality of the painting, but rather it was because of the story that was attached to it. Now, to be honest, today, you can go onto eBay and type in haunted items, and you'll get a million different things, haunted dolls and haunted artwork and all kinds of stuff. Today, it wouldn't be considered that weird, and honestly, most of those people are just trying to make a buck by claiming something is haunted. But back then, nobody had ever seen something like this on eBay, so it had a real novelty to it. But in the listing, the woman claimed that she had brought this painting home, and she had hung it up in her house. And very shortly after, within a few days, her daughter started to complain about this painting. At first, she said that late at night, when everybody else was asleep, the boy and the girl in the painting would come alive, and they would start to move. And then that escalated. And she said late at night, when everybody is asleep, the boy and the girl in the painting would start fighting with each other and shouting at each other. And then it escalated even further. And she said that not only were they fighting inside of the painting, but they would somehow come out of the painting and show up in her room late at night. Now, the woman was dismissive of this, as most parents probably would be, and blamed it on her daughter's imagination. But for whatever reason, the woman's husband decided to take this claim very, very seriously. And so he set up a motion-activated camera and he pointed it at the painting. And sure enough, as they claim, they saw the individuals in the painting moving. They saw the boy get down on all fours and start to crawl around. And then he would reach out as if he was trying to get out of the painting. Now, to be fair, she did not offer any evidence of this actually happening beyond the story, but it was enough for a lot of people on the internet to believe it, especially because many people who viewed that listing claimed that after seeing it and after reading about it, they would suffer from headaches and nausea. It was probably one of the first instances of something like this occurring on the internet. Only days after the initial bid of $199, the painting eventually sold for $1,050. And remember, this is year 2000, so that was very pricey, especially for eBay at that time. The posting and the creepy backstory behind it had cemented itself as legend in the early days of the internet, and because of this, sleuths online were determined to learn more about this painting and about why it was so creepy and if there was any truth to the fact that there was something paranormal going on with this work of art. Eventually, they determined that the painting went back to the year 1972 when it was originally painted. And I'll get into the artist in a few minutes. But the person who purchased the painting for the first time was in 1974. It was purchased by a man named John Marley. And Marley was an actor. And he wasn't a super well-known actor, but he was a guy who had been in a lot of different things. And he's been in things that you are probably at least somewhat familiar with. He was in The Twilight Zone, and he was in Gunsmoke, he was in Perry Mason, he even had a role in The Godfather. So he purchases the painting in 1974, but within the next 10 years, he would be dead, following complications from surgery. Now, back in 1974, when Marley originally purchased the painting, he decided to have it reviewed by an art critic to determine, how much the painting was actually worth and if he could resell it later on. And so The art critic came to his house and took a look at the painting, but only 4 years after that, that art critic would be dead. Shortly after Morley passed away, the painting would find its way to an art gallery, where it would be stored for some time. But shortly after being delivered to the art gallery, the owner of that gallery, too, would pass away, this time from unknown causes. It seemed like whoever came into contact with this painting found their way into an early grave. It was Marley, it was the art critic, it was the owner of the gallery. People were thinking that perhaps this painting was cursed. Not much is known what happened with the painting after the early 1980s. It obviously stayed in that gallery for some time, and then it likely changed hands a few times before eventually winding up, somehow, in that abandoned brewery, where the eBay woman would buy it and then resell it. The winner of the online auction was a man by the name of Kim Smith. So in my research, I kept seeing the name Kim Smith pop up over and over again. Kim Smith. And I assumed wrongly that this was a woman, but Kim Smith is very much a man and has an absolutely phenomenal mustache. So I've gone back through and I tried to re-record any instance where I referred to him as a woman, but apologies if I missed any, especially to you, Kim Smith. I know you will never see this, but I am intensely jealous of your mustache. He was the owner of a place called Perception Gallery in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he took the painting and he housed it in his gallery. And as far as I can tell, it's been there ever since. And Kim Smith says that there has been no paranormal activity associated with that painting since he took ownership of it. Despite this, he was rather intrigued by the spooky story that was attached to this listing. Kim Smith decided to reach out to the artist. Surely whoever painted this work was some sort of madman, crazy artist who had found a way to pour malevolent energy and evil spirits into his work to take down anybody who came into contact with his painting, right? Not exactly. The artist who created this painting was a man by the name of Bill Stoneham. So Bill Stoneham gets an email from Kim Smith really out of the blue, and he's quite surprised that anybody's asking about this painting. He had painted it decades before, and he really hadn't thought about it since. And in the email, Kim had asked him if he was aware of kind of the creepy backstory and the internet legend that was now attached to his painting. And he said he had no idea about any of this, but he sort of understood why people would think that about his painting. He recognized that the imagery was rather creepy. But he explains that his reason for painting this and painting it the way that he did didn't have any sort of evil or paranormal intent behind it. Stoneham explained that the concept that he was trying to convey through this painting was one of Carl Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious. Now, this is essentially the idea that part of our psyche is shared by all humans. And it's formed throughout thousands of years and thousands of generations. And the generations who came before us are impacting us and impacting our lives and our behaviors and our thoughts in ways that we don't see and in ways that we don't fully understand. So he explains that the ghostly hands that are reaching out for the boy are meant to represent the hands of the thousands of generations who came before, that are trying to influence this boy in ways that he can't see and can't possibly understand. The boy himself, while he acknowledges looks pretty creepy, was painted after a photograph of Stoneham himself when he was 5 years old. And then the creepy doll that's standing next to him is meant to be young Stoneham's guide throughout this realm, who's explaining to him all of these different concepts that he would never be able to understand otherwise. The painting is still in the gallery in Grand Rapids, as far as I know, and Kim Smith has maintained that there have not been any sort of paranormal events that have occurred because of this painting. This one's kind of interesting to me because it can show how something that seems creepy on the surface and definitely looks creepy can be kind of misinterpreted. The artist was trying to make a statement on human psychology, which in retrospect, you understand what he was doing with the different choices that he made, but the imagery was so creepy that it just took on a life of its own. The name of the work is The Hands Resist Him, and it's actually part of an entire series by Bill Stoneham, which is pretty interesting and worth checking out. So the first two paintings that we talked about, right, the Crying Boy, The Hands Resist Him, they have clear origins, right? We know who painted them. We know roughly when they were painted. We know that Bill Stoneham was not an evil sorcerer who somehow cursed his painting. And we know that Giovanni Bergoglin was, well, I'm not really sure what to think about Giovanni Bergoglin, but I don't think that he intended to have any sort of paranormal entities infesting the prints of his artwork, even if he might have been potentially kind of a strange guy. But for this last one that I'm going to look at today, we really have no idea where this painting came from. So for this one, we are in St. Leonards-on-Sea in East Sussex in England in 2023. And in this small town, there is a charity shop, which I understand to be essentially the UK equivalent of what we would call a thrift shop in the US, where people can drop off goods that they don't want anymore, and then the shop will sell them at pretty steep discounts. So one day in 2023, several paintings show up in the donation bin of this charity shop. So the shopkeep brings them in and starts looking through them to try to decide on a price to resell these paintings for. And as she's looking through them, one of these portraits really catches her eye. It was a portrait of this girl. And at face value, there was nothing really notable about her or about the portrait itself, but there was just something about it that really stood out to the shopkeep. Like I said, the portrait itself wasn't inherently creepy, but maybe it was the really intense stare that this girl in the portrait was giving. Whatever it was, this painting really left an impression on the shopkeep. Either way, she puts a price of £20 on it, and she hangs it in the window and waits for somebody to come and buy it. And it only lasts in the window for a few days before, after about 3 days, a woman comes into the shop, purchases the painting, and takes it home with her. Only a couple days after that, that same woman comes back into the shop with the portrait in her hand. And she goes up to the counter and she explains that she would like to return the portrait. So the shopkeep says, all right, that's fine. Ask for a reason. And the woman doesn't give any specific reason about why she wants to return the portrait. All she says is that nothing good is going to come from this picture. Fair enough. The shopkeep tries to give her her £20 back, but the woman won't accept it. She says, no, I don't want my money back. I just don't want this portrait and I want to return it to you. It's a bit strange, but fair enough. She didn't want the portrait anymore. So the shopkeep takes it. And thinking about what that woman said is kind of half jokingly thinking, well, maybe this portrait is cursed. So she decides to put it back up into the window, but this time she adds a note. And the note says, possibly cursed? ? It was definitely odd, considering how the shopkeep had felt about this particular portrait the day she had first seen it. She had looked through 7 other portraits. She hadn't felt that way about any of the other ones that she saw, but this one particular portrait inexplicably kind of gave her the creeps. And within 3 days, the person who bought this portrait is back in the store saying, I don't even want my money back. I just want you to take the painting away from me. It's weird. A few more days go by, and then a woman named Zoe Elia Brown walks into the charity shop. Zoe was very intrigued by the painting, especially about the potential curse that would come with this painting. And so she, of course, doesn't get a whole lot of opportunities to buy potentially cursed objects and decides to buy the painting. And while the shopkeep is ringing her up, she makes sure to say to Zoe, by the way, this painting might have a curse associated with it. I just want to make sure that you saw the note. And she confirms, yes, I saw the note. That's one of the reasons why I'm actually buying it. She says, okay, as long as you saw it and you're aware, my conscience can be clear. So she brings the portrait home to the home that she shares with her mother, Jane. And it doesn't take long before Zoe starts to notice that her mother is developing a real affinity for this portrait, and not in a very healthy way. Zoe could see that her mother was spending large periods of time just staring at the portrait. And she started to polish the frame of the portrait repeatedly, even when she had just polished it the day before and there was really no need to. Zoe found the behavior to be pretty bizarre and pretty unlike her mother to become so enthralled with an object. This continued to escalate to the point that one morning Zoe gets up and gets out of bed and goes into the living room, and she sees her mother is stroking the cheekbones of the person in the image of this portrait. It had clearly gotten to the point that her mother had a very unhealthy obsession with this portrait and was becoming extremely protective of it. On another night, Zoe was fast asleep in her bed. It was the middle of the night, and she's awoken by the sound of knocking. And she realizes that the knocking is coming from her bedroom door on the other side. And so she thinks for a moment that it must be her mother who needs her help with something. So Zoe gets up and gets out of bed, goes over to the door, opens it up, but there's nothing. There's just a pitch black hallway and there's nobody around. This doesn't happen one time, but this happens for several consecutive nights that Zoe is awoken in the middle of the night by knocking on her bedroom door. But when she opens up the door, there's nobody there. Zoe was becoming convinced that these strange occurrences, the knocking, her mother's behavior, was a result of this supposed curse that at first she admittedly hadn't really taken seriously at all. But up to this point, although the happenings were strange, it was nothing dangerous that was going on. But that would all change pretty soon. Her mother Jane's health started to take a turn. She would experience these hot flashes, and then sometimes she would experience these periods of just intense coldness, where no matter what she did, she couldn't get warm. One day, Zoe walks into the living room and she sees her mother Jane sitting on a chair, just staring forward. And she notices that her mother's hands and arms are shaking violently. So she goes over to her mother and she says, "Mom, are you okay? What's going on?" And all Jane can say is, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." Zoe gets her blankets and jackets and puts them on her mother, but nothing seems to help. No matter how many blankets she puts on Jane, all Jane can say is, "I'm so cold." Eventually, Zoe is helping her mother get into the bathroom, and then Jane collapses onto the floor. Zoe's unsure of what she should do, but she calls for an ambulance. And only a few minutes later, her mother kind of just seems to snap out of it and goes back to seeming like everything's okay. She's not feeling cold. She's not shaking. She's acting completely normal again. So Zoe cancels the ambulance, but it really rattled her what had happened in this instance. Her mother had never experienced these sorts of things before. And Jane's obsession with the portrait continued, and Zoe continued to feel more and more frightened by the happenings that were going on inside of her house. One night, Zoe is just relaxing in bed, trying to wind down for the evening when she starts to smell smoke. And she's worried that something could be catching fire, and so she gets up and she goes into the kitchen, assuming that maybe, somebody left a burner on, but nothing in the kitchen is left on. She can't figure out where the source of this smoke is coming from, and she starts going from room to room in the house, trying to find the source of whatever this is before it catches fire, and eventually she comes to their internet router and sees smoke billowing out of it. Fortunately, she was able to unplug the router before it caught fire and turned into a catastrophic situation, but once again, this really rattled her. Any one of these components together might seem strange, but when you add them all together, her mother's mental and physical health, the knocking, the smoking router, when you put them all together, Zoe believed in her heart that all of this was a result of that portrait and that curse. Zoe is beginning to feel stressed beyond her limits, and she doesn't quite know what to do about the situation, so she decides that she just needs some time to clear her head. So her and her partner Ben decide to go on this little scenic walk. It was a walk that they had done many times together. It was this 3-mile loop near to their house. It would go through kind of some wooded areas and then up a hill. And then on the top of the hill was this clearing. And it was a very nice walk. They had done it, like I said, 1,000,000 times in the past, never had an issue. And for the first part of their walk, there's no issues. And they start to walk up this hill. And as they're getting closer to the top of the hill, they can see now off into the distance and they see a storm starting to roll in. They can see that the sky is darkening and it's moving rather quickly, but they think that they still have enough time to finish the rest of their walk, get up to the clearing, and then get back to the house before the storm hits. Just as they're getting to the clearing, the sky is getting rather dark. Kind of turn a corner around some trees, and there, standing just before them, only feet away, is this pitch black figure. It was impossibly tall, and it was apparently looking down at them, staring at them. And Zoe feels like this figure, whatever it is evil. They don't stay to get a better look at it. Instead, they run all the way back to the house. They sprint as fast as they can, and Ben makes sure that Zoe stays ahead of him because he wants to make sure that he puts himself between Zoe and whatever this thing is. And Zoe is too afraid to look back, to check and see if this thing is chasing her, but she hears Ben screaming, "Zoe, you need to run faster. It's right behind me." This thing, whatever it was chasing them. Somewhere along the way, between that clearing and their home, though, it just disappeared. It stopped chasing them and it evaporated. At this point, enough is enough. Zoe cannot risk anything more happening. She can't risk her mother's health. She can't risk another encounter with whatever this figure was. She can't risk her house catching on fire. She has to do something, and she doesn't know what else to do other than to return this portrait back to the charity shop. And so that's what she does. She goes back to the charity shop just like the first purchaser of that portrait did, and they were happy to take it back. And Zoe was feeling very relieved about the fact that she was able to get rid of this thing. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But that night, as she's laying in bed, she just keeps thinking about it. And all she can think about is that somebody else is going to buy that portrait. Somebody else is going to bring that thing into their homes, and it could potentially destroy their life. What if somebody suffers the same fate as her? What if somebody suffers an even worse fate? What if somebody gets seriously hurt or worse? What if they take this portrait, they realize what's happening, and they try to burn it? Zoe believed that burning that portrait would not solve anything and could potentially make the situation even worse. She felt like she had to be the one in control of the situation because she would not be able to live with the guilt if something terrible happened to somebody else. Despite being terrified of what the consequences might be for this, she goes back to the charity shop and she takes that portrait home with her once again. But this time, immediately after getting the portrait, she seals it into a wooden box and then she covers that box in sage, hoping that that will somehow seal in whatever evil is associated with this portrait. And then, like our last story, Zoe puts the portrait into an online auction with a very clear note explaining that this portrait is cursed and it is evil, and there's a very good chance that you're going to regret buying it if you do. Regardless, there are many offers to buy this portrait, and it is eventually sold to a company called the London Bridge Experience, where it has remained since. Zoe decides to split the proceeds from the online sale with the charity shop, and she was also very relieved that the organization that took this painting was one that specialized in kind of spooky history and paranormal history and that sort of thing. So she felt like hopefully they're equipped to deal with this curse. Remember, this all happened in 2023, so it really has not been that long. And so this story could develop even more over time. And sure enough, the staff at the London Bridge Experience have claimed that some weird stuff has gone on because of this painting. There's been weird noises. There's been electrical issues that didn't happen before the painting was brought in. They've had issues with their cameras in the vicinity of the painting not working properly. But so far, there have not been any hospitalizations, and there have not been any 9-foot-tall demonic entities that I know of. Thank you so much for watching my spooky video. Sorry there's a couple weeks there that I could not upload a video. I had a lot of family stuff going on over the holidays, obviously. And then I got sick, as many people do, over the holidays, and I completely lost my voice. So I had to wait until I was once again able to communicate in order to make a video. Now, was it a run-of-the-mill upper respiratory infection? Or could it have been the evil forces of the crying boy who entered my body to try to silence me about telling the truth? It was probably just an upper respiratory infection, but you never know. Could have been something else. Anyway, things are good here in the void. As always, I greatly appreciate every single one of you who watches my videos or likes it or comments on it. I can't tell you how amazing it's been to get. I think recently I hit 8,000 subscribers, and that's so many more than I ever thought I would get. For a long time I had like 40 subscribers, and that seemed like a lot to me. And so the fact that 8,000 people would want to watch my videos is truly amazing and humbling, and I really, really do appreciate it. So if you are not subscribed yet and you like spooky stories, please consider subscribing, and I will do my best to bring spooky stories to you on a regular basis, and hopefully I will not disappear for a month again anytime soon, unless the spirits try to stop me. In which case, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, I could disappear for forever tomorrow. I do live in a void, so you never know what's going to happen in the void. But anyway, thank you again so very much, and I'll see you guys next time.